Sports. I love them, you love them. If you're watching this, you probably like ancient history of an American flavor as well, and if you don't, well, then stick around. Team sports in particular have a special place in the hearts of many. Not only do they provide us with an avenue to display and admire athletic ability and prowess in a competitive environment, but they paradoxically kindle a sense of community while at the same time playing to our rivalries. Who hasn't gone to a high stakes game and gotten lost in the roar of the crowd as your team clinches a win with a daring last second maneuver? We also associate a lot of ritual and ceremony around sports. Think of pregame rituals, game watch parties, and victory celebrations. Today, we are going to learn that none of this is new. In fact, team sports and all the baggage that goes with it was alive and well in ancient Mesoamerica, and no sport was more popular than the Mesoamerican ballgame. This sport is widely regarded by scholars as the oldest team sport in history, and it was wildly popular. So popular, in fact, that ball games were played beyond Mesoamerica in the American Southwest and even all the way in the Caribbean. Nor is the game a relic of the past. Indigenous ball games are still played in Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize today. And I don't mean as performances for tourists, but actual games between and within communities. While this might look like a simple game to us, to the ancient people of Mesoamerica, the ball game was more than just a game. It was steeped in their mythology and cosmology. It was an intersection of athletic competition and religious ceremony. There's so much to unpack here. So come on and slam and welcome to the jam. One quick word before we get started. There will be an important announcement at the end of this video, so stay tuned afterwards. Okay, this is going to be a weird episode. At first, I wanted to do my normal format where I discuss the historical development of the ball game before diving into the cultural specifics. Instead, I'm going to be inverting the format by discussing the workings of the ball game and its cultural significance so that we can better appreciate its development up to the modern day. Also, just a quick word on chronology, we'll be referring to the pre-classic, classic, and post-classic periods through the episode. The dates for those are here, and I'll do my best to show the chart when we get into the history. With that said, let's strap in and go over some ballgame fundamentals. It's Mesoamerican Ballgame 101. First, we need to define exactly what I mean when I say the Mesoamerican ballgame, because technically the Mesoamerican ballgame was not one ballgame, but many. When you think of the Mesoamerican ballgame, you probably think of depictions of ball players striking a ball with their hips towards an opposing team, or you might remember that ballgame scene from the movie El Dorado. Good times. However, when we look at ballgame depictions in the artistic and archaeological record, we can see different versions being played. Some of it is a bit subtle, such as the size of the ball, the number of players, and the size and dimensions of the ball court. But there are depictions of handstones or clubs being used to strike the ball, and these seem to represent a different ball game. With that in mind, I want to provide what I consider a good baseline description and primer of the ball game and how it was played. To do this, let's look at Spanish accounts of the ball game as it was played by the Nahua people of the former Aztec Empire. Just a quick note, the Aztec Empire was made up of many ethnically and linguistically diverse peoples, of which the Nahua were one ethnicity, although there were Nahua populations outside the empire's control as well. The empire itself was technically an alliance of three city-states that shared a common language, Nahuatl. When I say Nahua, I'm referring to these people that made up the core of the empire, and from where most of our indigenous sources about it come from. As I mentioned earlier, this version is not how everyone everywhere would have played it, but it does give us a useful baseline to understand the basics. The Nahuatl name of the game was Ulamalitzli, and this is the name I'll be using to describe the quote-unquote standard ball game, even though this is arbitrary and this is not the name by which most people in Mesoamerica would have known it. Witnesses describe the game thus. The ball could be struck with the hips, buttocks, or knees. The ball was a solid rubber ball that was about 3 to 4 kilograms or 6 to 8 pounds, and it was bounced between players at a fast pace. Those same witnesses note that the ball was kept in constant motion. Scoring was done by awarding points when the ball bounced twice before being returned, when out of bounds, or when a team attempted and missed hitting the ball into one of the stone rings on the sides of the ball court. A successful hit of the ball through the rings won the game instantly, just like catching the golden snitch in Quidditch. Speaking of ball courts, let's quickly discuss how ball courts were designed. Again, there's a bit of variation here in size, shape, and features. Over 2,000 ancient ball courts have been documented, so we have a ton of examples to draw from. Let's illustrate a typical ball court briefly. In the middle is the playing alley. This narrow field is where the playing would occur. The alley was often divided into two halves, one for each team. Some ball courts could even have beautiful court markers in the middle and on the sides to mark the two halves. On either side of the alley are two end zones against terminal structures, which give most ball courts their signature I shape. Flanking the sides of the court are two structures that can be made of earth or stone. These have a sloping apron that runs to a cornice and a top. Occasionally, there might be a bench at the base of the apron adjacent to the alley. Some ball courts also have rings tenoned into the cornice at the top of the apron. Rings only appear in ball courts later in Mesoamerican history. Ball courts were likely not just used for ball games, but may have been important ceremonial spaces where crowds could view performances or rituals held in the alley, or vice versa. Some games played may have been more theatrical and dramatic, with dancers, singers, and ceremonies, perhaps recreating stories from mythology. A good example of a ball court used for such events can be seen at the main ball court at Chichen Itza. This ball court is comically big, measuring at a whopping 168 by 70 meters. A team of ball players would be lost in those cavernous environs. Look how tiny these people are. The rings are 6 meters above the court, far higher than anyone could actually bounce a ball with their hip. This has prompted some scholars to suggest that this was a ceremonial space first and a ball court second. One important thing we need to discuss is the ball. As I mentioned earlier, these balls were made out of rubber, and they bounced. It's probably not a coincidence that the Nahuatl word for rubber, oli, is suspiciously close to the word for movement, olin. We take bouncy balls for granted today. Basketball, soccer, and volleyball are all fine examples of sports that rely on a ball that can bounce. However, in the ancient world, that wasn't the case. Most balls outside of Mesoamerica were made of wood, leather, or cloth. Compared to balls made out of those other materials, a rubber ball is going to fly after it bounces. Rubber was obtained from plant latexes. Although latex is produced by over 12,000 plants today, including the familiar dandelion, the preferred source of rubber in Mesoamerica came from the Panama rubber tree, not to be confused with the South American Para rubber tree that most commercial rubber is made out of today. Once the latex was collected from the tree, it had to be processed and then vulcanized so that rubber strips could be rolled together in skein and shaped into a sphere. It's also worth mentioning that rubber had many uses beyond rubber balls. Rubber could be used as an adhesive for attaching stone tools to handles, a base for black body paint, a material for effigies, a material for waterproofing and footwear, and could even be used for medicinal purposes. Now, when I say that the ball was made out of rubber, I mean that it was solid rubber, and it was heavy. This isn't like dodgeball in gym class where a ball to the face is just going to leave a mark. If you got hit with that in the wrong place, you could be seriously injured. In a worst case scenario, a hit to the head could even be lethal. The ball game could be dangerous. So how did ball players protect themselves from such a potentially brutal sport? Let's answer that question by taking a look at some common gear. The Quiche Maya creation story, the Popol Vuh, actually gives us a pretty good, albeit brief, description of the gear of a ball player when the sons of one Hunahpu are told that their grandmother still has their father's ball playing gear. To quote,
"It is what belonged to your fathers, one Hunahpu and 7 Hunahpu by name, who died in Xibalba. They left behind their gaming things hanging above the house, their yokes, their arm protectors, and their rubber ball as well."
Here we see a mention of the ball, yokes, and arm protectors. We've already discussed the ball, but what on earth is a yoke? A yoke is a U-shaped object worn around a player's torso as protection from the impact of the ball. This example here is made of stone. Most of these are open, but there are examples of closed yokes. Now, before you rush to the comments, no, these stone versions were likely not used in real ball games. Real ones were likely made of wood, leather, or some other fabric, but those have long since perished. You can see examples of this padding in a lot of figurines. These stone yokes are probably ceremonial versions of the equipment worn on special occasions, or perhaps before and after games, or possibly grave goods for ball players to take to the afterlife. Yokes are some of the most common ball game artifacts, and they can be beautifully carved with different motifs. Another common artifact are yuguitos, literally little yokes in Spanish. These small covers are believed to have been used to protect the knee or hand from the ball. Now that we know the basics of the game, the layout of the court, and the equipment the players used, let's talk about the symbolism and meaning that was imbued in the ball game. I know I sound like a broken record, but do keep in mind that we are talking about a huge culturally diverse geographical area over many centuries. There was variety in these ball games, and so many people had different associations and meanings with the games. Also, a lot of the art and architecture surrounding the ball game was commissioned by elites, and this colors our perspective. It gives us a great view into how the Mesoamerican elites saw the ball game and employed it, but that comes at the expense of how the average person viewed and played the ball game. As a result, something that often gets lost in discussions of the ball game is that it was first and foremost a recreational sport, and this is likely how the majority of people in small communities would have seen the game. We all understand that there's a huge difference between the motivations behind a group of kids playing a pickup game of basketball in a park and an NBA player playing professional basketball for millions of dollars in front of a national audience. With that in mind, one can imagine children in a village picking up their ball and playing a pickup game with their friends for fun, or perhaps a community organizing a ball game as part of a festival. As we'll see later, in indigenous communities that still play these ball games, these are a part of local culture and are incorporated into community events. With that out of the way, let's get into some of the more esoteric themes of the ball game. Again, we aren't going to go into every theory out there, but we can hit the popular ones. A common theme that appears is duality. Both teams could represent opposing forces of light and darkness, life and death, and good and evil. A good example of this concept can be seen in offerings that were buried in the ball court foundations in the Mexica capital of Tenochtitlan, modern day Mexico City. Excavations of the ball court revealed several offerings. Among the offerings were a miniature model of the ball court and two stone balls, one black, one white, likely representations of the night and day or the sun and the moon. Central Mexican people appear to have connected the ball game with astronomy. Many authors have suggested that the ball in the ball game represented the sun traveling through the sky in the cosmos. The Codex Borgia from the 16th century has many associations with Venus and the ball game. Not only are some ball players painted with red stripes, like the sacrifices dedicated to Tlahuitzcalpantecutli, the god of Venus as the morning star, but the god of Venus as the evening star, Xolotl, was a noted player of the ball game in Nahua mythology. Thus, to the Nahuas living in the Aztec Empire, the ball game had strong symbolic connections with the cosmos and the heavens. Other cultures linked the ball game instead to the underworld, and nowhere is this better illustrated than in ancient Maya culture. We can get a wonderful example of this by returning to the Popol Vuh. In the story, the Lords of Death summon the hero twins 1 Hunahpu and 7 Hunahpu to a ball game in Xibalba, the watery Maya underworld, after getting upset at how much noise the twins are making up on the surface of the earth. Unfortunately for the hero twins, the Lords of Death prevail and sacrifice both of them. To quote the text after they fail a test by the Lords of Death,
"This very day, your day, is finished. You will die, you will disappear, and we shall break you off. Here you will hide your faces. You are to be sacrificed," said 1 and 7 Death. And then they were sacrificed and buried. They were buried at the place of ball game sacrifice, as it is called. The head of 1 Hunahpu was cut off. Only his body was buried with his younger brother.
don't worry about 1 and 7 Hunahpu, they get saved in the end. 1 Hunahpu's twin sons later journey to the underworld, best the Lords of Death in a ball game, and eventually defeat and sacrifice them. After which they resurrect their father, who ascends into the sky to become the maize god. If you're interested in this creation story, we have an entire episode on the Popol Vuh that you can watch later. The important takeaway here, however, is that the ball game and the ball court had powerful connections with the underworld, death, sacrifice, as well as rebirth and fertility. Sacrifice and fertility are other important themes we see associated with the ball game. These might seem paradoxical to us, but we need to remember that in ancient Mesoamerica, sacrifice was linked to fertility and regeneration, as was the case in many ancient cultures all over the world. Thus, sacrifices associated with the ball game helped replenish the earth. Returning to central Mexico, in Nahua mythology, the rising of the sun represented a triumph over the forces of darkness and the underworld, and this was made possible by human sacrifice. The ball game was one of several means by which human blood could be offered to the gods. In the Aztec Empire, warriors captured in battle would often be ritually sacrificed to this end, but some were allowed to participate in the ball game so that they could die in a simulated battle, thus preserving their honor. It may not be a coincidence that the sites of Tenochtitlan, Tula, and Chichen Itza had skull racks very near their main ball courts. There are also depictions of decapitation and sacrifice at ball courts in different areas as well. At the site of Chichen Itza, reliefs show a victorious ball player holding the head of his vanquished opponent. Between him and the unfortunate competitor is a ball with a skull inside. But most interesting is that the opponent has 7 snakes sprouting from his wound, symbolizing new life. Similar reliefs in Veracruz and the southern Pacific coast feature dramatic scenes of sacrifice or decapitation, where blood turns into snakes or plants. Not only that, stone ball gear was also sometimes decorated with sacrifice scenes as well. Now, I want to detour for a hot second and throw out a quick caveat. I'm sure many of you viewers have heard or read that the losers of the ball game were sacrificed, and scenes like this are where the idea comes from. While it is true that sacrifice did accompany the ball game at certain times, this wasn't a constant feature. It couldn't have been. Just ask yourself who the heck would have played a game where the loser had to be killed? I suspect that the NBA would find a sudden and dramatic talent shortage if the commissioner decreed that the last place team had to be sacrificed to the ancient gods. That would really put a damper on the Olympics. Common and recreational ball games would not have had such a morbid ending. The games that we're talking about here were probably part of specific elite ceremonies. Speaking of which, the ball game was also a way for elites to enhance their prestige while also giving them a competitive outlet. Talented ball players were afforded a prominence like professional athletes are in our society. Remember that ball players risked serious, possibly even fatal injury playing the game. Being good at this at such a high level took a lot of talent and a lot of guts. Spanish sources report that professional ball players could be awarded special honors and privileges, often becoming the intimates of rulers. However, rulers themselves were not afraid to get in on the action. As we've already seen, many elites are shown playing the ball game. Maya art in particular shows rulers dressed as ball players playing the ball game in elaborate and religiously charged costumes. Feel free to conjure an image of a national leader playing football in a gaudy, metal-laden military uniform and a religious helmet. You're welcome. Many of these outfits emphasize their connection to the gods or their martial prowess, such as this example, in which the standing figure on the left wears a chalk mask on his waist, denoting a possibly imminent sacrifice of his opponent on the ground. One of the most vivid illustrations of the ball game tied to elite ceremony can be seen at the site of El Tajín in Veracruz. The main ball court is decorated with a complicated series of carved panels. According to art historian Rex Coons, these reliefs show 2 men dressed in ballgame regalia on a ball court forming an alliance. This is followed by a warrior receiving atlatl darts from a god, which is likely a prelude for an upcoming battle. In the aftermath, a war captive is offered as a sacrifice, and in exchange for the severed head of this ballgame victim, the man receives the symbols of rulership. This would seem to indicate a ceremony centered on rulership that utilized the imagery of the ball game. Now, not all elite use of the ball game resulted in death and violence. Games could be used as a way to resolve conflict or as a substitute for military confrontation. Many histories recount games between elites to settle disputes. According to Fernando Alvarado Tezosomac's account in the Crónica Mexicayot, the king of Texcoco, Nezahualpilli, played a best-of-5 ball game series against Moctezuma in order to determine who was correct about a prophecy of an impending conquest. In another example, Fernando de Alva Cortez Ixtachiochit mentions a Toltec story where the Toltec king Topiltzin played a game against three rivals to establish his right to rule over them. Indeed, many scholars have noted that ball court construction picked up noticeably during times of heightened political competition, and some scholars have used this line of evidence to speculate that ball courts may have acted as a cathartic release between ethnically or linguistically diverse people living next to each other. Games were also a very popular avenue for gambling. Fray Juan de Torquemada recounts a story of a match between the Mexica king Ashakayat and the king of Xochimilco, Xahuitlamoc, playing a game in which Ashakayat wagered his annual income against the tribute of several towns under Xochimilco's control. What's wild is that these guys were allies, and they were betting staggering sums of money on this game. Ashakayat lost the match, and being a bit of a sore loser, had Xahuitlamoc assassinated. Fun times in the Aztec Empire. But a better description of this comes from Fray Diego Duran, who wrote of the ball game in the 16th century.
They gambled their homes, their corn, granaries, their maguey plants. They sold their children in order to bet, and even staked themselves, and became slaves to be sacrificed later if they were not ransomed.
Remember, folks, if you have a gambling problem, please get help and don't bet your kid's future away. Thus, we can see that the ball game performed a variety of functions. Not only was it a recreational and communal game, one that could bring communities together, resolve disputes, and provide spectacle as people cheered and gambled away their retirement, but it was also a game deeply embedded in mythology and religion that pitted dualist forces against each other in the realm of sport. Elites did not hesitate to co-opt this for their own political ends and weave the ball game into propaganda and royal ceremony. Now that we have those basics under our belts, it's time to take a look at the origins of the ball game. What is the earliest evidence we have for the ball game? The earliest evidence dates back to the early pre-classic period. To see this, we need to look at the Olmec by going to the Olmec site of El Manatee. This amazing site is a bog where the Olmecs left ritual offerings thousands of years ago. Normally, organic objects like rubber deteriorate over time, but luckily for us, the bog's conditions preserved these offerings. Among the items recovered from the site were 12 rubber balls that were dated to about 1600 BCE. This is important because it tells us that the Olmec were making rubber balls for the ball game. Now, if you want to be skeptical, you could argue that these balls could have been used for other purposes rather than the ball game, but because an early example of a yoke has been recovered at El Manatee, scholars interpret these as evidence of an Olmec ball game. Beyond El Manatee, there's other Olmec evidence as well. Figurines of ball players have been recovered from Olmec sites, as well as Olmec influence sites in the Valley of Mexico. At San Lorenzo, the earliest major Olmec site, fragments of ball players have been recovered that show men wearing ball playing gear. However, the best figurines from this time actually come from Tlapacoya in the Valley of Mexico. This is where we find many ball player figures that scholars call pili-type figurines. Most figures depict men, likely elites or gods, richly costumed with padded belts, pectorals, and loincloths, but also with religious and political symbols. For example, maize symbolism appears in many figurines, showing that from an early time the ball game already had associations with fertility. These early ball player figurines include female players, and what's interesting is that they are depicted as ordinary people, unlike their richly adorned male counterparts. These depictions of female ball players suggest that the game began as a pastime played by common people, and that it wasn't restricted to the nobility. This is very strong evidence that the Ulamalitzli was being played long ago by the Olmec. Now, the Olmec and their cronies don't have a monopoly on early depictions of the ball game. If we go to West Mexico at the site of El Opeño in Michoacan, several ball player figurines arranged together in a scene were recovered from a tomb that dated to between 1700 and 1500 BCE. Spoiler alert, this won't be the last time we find a ball game scene in West Mexico. What's interesting about these figurines is how different they are than the Olmec-style figurines. These figures are minimally costumed and clad in comparatively little ball-playing attire, but even more striking is that they appear to be holding bats or sticks, maybe gloves, that were likely used to strike the ball. This shows that other types of ball games, and not just the Ulamalitzli, were being played at a very early date. Before we leave El Peño, however, we should mention that it also has the earliest yugitos that have been recovered, although other early examples can be found in the Valley of Mexico, Guerrero, and Veracruz. But let's look at what Tlapacoya, Olmec, and West Mexican sites lack. None of them have produced any evidence of ball courts. At this point, we know that people were playing ball games, but archaeologists haven't been able to locate any architecture dedicated to the ball game at any of these sites. That's not to say that there are no ball courts from this time. You just need to go to other parts of Mesoamerica to find them. The earliest ball court comes from the site of Paso de la Amada, all the way on the Pacific coast of Chiapas, and it dates to about 1600 BCE. This simple ball court is just two parallel earthen mounds flanking a playing alley. It's a very simple design that we'll see developed and elaborated. Another early ball court was recently discovered at the site of Etlatango in the Mexican state of Oaxaca. This one dates from between 1443 and 1305 BCE and is currently the oldest known ball court in the Mexican highlands. Like Paso de la Amada, it also has that simple design of just two parallel mounds on either side of the alley. Already at an early date, there's ample evidence that ball games were being played across much of Mesoamerica by commoners and elites. Not only that, but it was taking on associations with fertility and was becoming important enough to warrant dedicated playing spaces in some areas. This continued to ramp up until the end of the pre-classic period around 200 CE. One way that we can see this is in the proliferation of art and artifacts related to the ball game. Some of my personal favorites from this time come from the shaft tomb tradition of the West Mexican coast. These burial offerings show many rich scenes of everyday life, but more importantly for us now, they include many depictions of ball players and ball games. These dioramas are some of the best three-dimensional depictions of the ball game. Not only can we see players on the court, but we also see spectators on the lateral structures. It lets us tap into the excitement and entertainment of the game. I love it. These sculptures in West Mexico also speak to an increasing reach of the ball game. It's very likely that the ball game was introduced into this area from central Mexico or the Pacific coast, because this area of West Mexico lacks access to rubber. On the Atlantic coast in Veracruz, we see evidence that the ball game was becoming more elaborate and prestigious. Ball game yokes that are intricately carved in high relief have been dated to the pre-classic. This example here has a toad head carved into the curve. As I said earlier, it's unlikely that such heavy pieces were worn in games, and this is likely ceremonial regalia. A stela at the site of Teotihuacan in Veracruz shows a player being dressed for a game, and this gives us a good picture of how a player at the time would have been attired. You can see padding and straps on the knees, hands, and his body to protect him from the impact of the ball and the ground. We can see other interesting ball-playing gear elsewhere in Mesoamerica. In the Valley of Oaxaca, at the site of Dainzu, reliefs depict a ball player wearing a mask and holding a small ball in their hand. Similar images can be seen at the Maya site of El Baul, where two costumed figures hold similarly sized handheld balls in their gloves. At the end of the pre-classic at 200 CE, we can see that ball games were formalized and thriving. Judging from the presence of ball courts that date to this time, we know that the ball game was being played from the western coast of Mexico all the way to Honduras. It was a coast-to-coast phenomenon. However, in the early classic period from 200 to 600 CE, construction of new ball courts slowed to a trickle. This was, by and large, a prosperous time in Mesoamerica, so this is kind of unexpected. All across Mesoamerica, old ball courts fell into disuse, and few new courts were constructed, with a few odd exceptions. First, West Mexico continued building ball courts in the early Classic, and examples of these survive at Teotihuacan sites like Huachimontones. Second, northern Veracruz and the Huasteca region were also continuing to use and maintain their ball courts. The last and most interesting exception, however, are the Palangana-style courts, which are fully enclosed sunken courts shaped like a rectangular basin. They are found in Oaxaca, Tehuacan, Chiapas, and the Guatemalan highlands, and date to the late pre-classic and early classic period. Why this unique design arose during such a brief period is unclear, but there's speculation that it may have been designed for a specific version of the ball game. You may be asking why the early classic period shows such a dearth in ball court construction. For a possible explanation, we need to go to the city that in many ways defined the early classic period in Mesoamerica, Teotihuacan. If you aren't familiar with this city, I recommend checking out our episode on it, but in summary, Teotihuacan was a massive city in the Valley of Mexico that left a huge cultural impact on Mesoamerica. Now, given that Teotihuacan was a huge city, you'd expect it to have the Yankee Stadium of ball courts, but that's not the case. In fact, it's the opposite. To date, no ball court has ever been identified at Teotihuacan, although excavations in the Ciudadela in 2015 recovered features that may have been a basic ball court in the late pre-classic, but even if it was a ball court, this was buried when the Ciudadela was expanded and would not have been used during the city's heyday. This lack of ball courts at Teotihuacan has perplexed archaeologists for decades. You might conclude that Teotihuacanos were unfamiliar with the ball game or didn't play it, but we know that Teotihuacanos were familiar with the ball game because murals of ball players have been found in the Tepantitla Palace at Teotihuacan. These murals are very interesting. They show the Ulamalitzli being played, but many scholars have commented on how these murals depict the players and the game they play as foreign. However, the same murals show another ball game in which a ball is struck with sticks, and another in a field with end zones marked by stone monuments rather than on a traditional ball court. What's interesting is that examples of these end zone markers have been found at Teotihuacan and some other classic period sites, which suggests that this game was being played at Teotihuacan and elsewhere. Eric Talador suggests that during Teotihuacan's supremacy, the city and its elites may have been promoting a specific ball game that was different from the Ulamalitzli. Could Teotihuacan's influence be behind this decline in ball courts? It's possible, but we can't know for sure. It is very telling that after Teotihuacan's decline, new elaborate ball courts show up all over the classical world again. Even at sites formerly dominated by Teotihuacan, like Matacapan, ball courts began to be built in Teotihuacan's wake. The late classic and terminal classic periods in many ways represent the peak of the ball game's popularity. One way that we can see this is in the ball courts that were constructed during the period. Until the late classic, ball courts followed a fairly simple design that we highlighted earlier, but in the late classic, they became increasingly elaborate and diverse. A common feature in ball courts from this time period is that the court's end zones were usually enclosed. Many courts, like these examples, became enclosed completely. In the terminal classic, those iconic rings started to appear at many ball courts. Ball courts were also incorporated into city centers as important features of civic architecture. By the end of the classic period, nearly every major city had a ball court, and some sites had multiple ball courts. Sites such as Chichen Itza, El Tajín, and Cantona all have over a dozen known ball courts, with Cantona sporting an insane 24 ball courts, possibly more. During the late and terminal classic periods, there's also a wealth of art related to the ball game. The two areas that really stand out in this regard are the Maya region and the Gulf Coast. Maya art has a rich corpus of ball game and ball player depictions. We know from the decipherment of Maya writing that the classic Maya called their ball game Peets. From depictions in art, we can tell that the game was played with teams of 2 players, possibly 3 at some times. The ball shown in many of these depictions is rather large, but this might be an exaggeration. Many balls also have a skull painted on them. I read one author who suggested that the Maya may have put skulls inside of the balls to create a hollow ball and lighten it to improve the bounce, but as far as I know, there's no archaeological evidence for this. Maya ball players at the time wore the standard panoply of yokes and padding around their torso, knees, and forearms. They are also usually depicted wearing deer hide hip cloths as well as headdresses. As we mentioned earlier, these have powerful religious symbolism. An interesting feature about Maya representations of the ball game is how architecture is portrayed. Many depictions show steps rather than the standard sloping sides of a ball court. These could be depictions of end zones, but other depictions suggest that these were actually pyramid steps. Over in Veracruz, there's a similarly rich ball game record. We've already discussed the site of El Tajín and its ball court panels. Those all date from this period. Veracruz also provides a wealth of model ball game gear crafted in stone. Now, these are nothing new. Many beautifully carved examples of yokes were made up until now. What we see in Veracruz at the time is an elaboration of this gear. Hachas and palmas were carved as accoutrements for these stone yokes. Hacha comes from the Spanish word for axe, and they were carved figures, often human or animal heads, that were fitted into the yoke, again, likely as part of ceremonial regalia. These actually have their origin in the early Classic but became popular in the late Classic. Later, they were replaced by palmas, which are thin triangular pads that would have served as chest protectors. The stone versions have beautiful designs carved into them. These, along with the art that we've already seen from Veracruz during this period, give us a glimpse into the rich and ornate pageantry that surrounded the ball game at its cultural zenith. Lastly, the late Classic period is when the ball game really starts getting exported to the fringes of Mesoamerica and beyond. The Classic period is when ball courts start showing up in the American Southwest, particularly among the Hohokam. These ball courts are rather distinct because they don't conform to the expected alley or I-shaped design. Instead, these are large oval depressions with embankments on either side, and there's a lot of variety in their size and depth. Unfortunately, we only have a very vague understanding of the game that the Hohokam would have played, but it's unlikely to have been similar to the Ulamalitzli. The ball game's presence in the Southwest would prove fleeting, as ball courts stopped being built after 1100 CE. During the late Classic, ball games would also appear in Taino-settled areas of the Caribbean as well, but there's some debate as to whether this was an independent invention or something that came from Mesoamerica. These courts are much more simple playing areas lined with stone. Either way, the game persisted in the Caribbean all the way until European contact. After the end of the Terminal Classic around 1000 CE, the ball game appears to have lost some of its prestige. To be sure, it was still being played and enjoyed, and many traditions were carried on, but things were changing. In a dramatic example, the ball game appears to fall off the architectural map in the Maya lowlands after Chichen Itza's decline. Later Maya post-classic sites like Mayapan and Tulum have no ball courts. The Highland Maya, on the other hand, continued to build ball courts in their cities. The best evidence we have for the ball game in the post-classic, however, comes from the Aztec Empire. The imperial capital of Tenochtitlan had two ball courts, both of which are buried under modern-day Mexico City. As we mentioned earlier, the Nahua elites incorporated the ball game into many different ceremonies. It's very telling that the patron god of the ball game was Xochipilli, who was also the god of flowers, music, and dancing. These ceremonies would have likely included music and dancing by spectators and players alike. The main ball court, the Teotihuacan, was the site of many ceremonies and sacrifices dedicated to Huitzilopochtli. That said, many scholars I've read have written that the ball game in the Aztec Empire had become more secularized. Now, what follows is my own personal take, so please take it with a grain of salt. The scholars are way smarter than me, and there could be evidence I'm not taking into account. That said, I personally find these claims of secularization somewhat inflated. In my humble opinion, the game probably always had a secular aspect to it. I can't imagine that ball games were totally monopolized by elites in earlier centuries. However, earlier secular games were probably not recorded in earlier art because much of that art was monopolized by the elites. The reason that secularization gets brought up is because after the conquest, the Spanish were able to observe normal people playing the ball game outside of any religious ceremony. The indigenous Nahua sources, from what I can tell, only present the elite version of the game when they discuss it, and I'm assuming that the same would have been true of earlier cultures. That's just my 2 cents, and I may be missing a critical piece of information, so please don't take this as gospel, but as my own observations and opinions. If anyone wants to tell me why I'm off base, please let me know in the comments. If you can cite any sources, that would be amazing. It's in the wake of the Aztec Empire that the Spanish witnessed the ball game being played. For those who were able to see it, the ball game was a thrilling spectacle. The bouncing rubber balls were so strange and exciting to the Spanish that some actually thought that they were possessed. So impressed was Hernan Cortez that among the spoils that he took back to Spain on his return was a team of ball players, and the people at the court of Charles V went wild. In fact, they were so popular that court artist Christoph Weiditz actually recorded a picture of them. Unfortunately, this did not mean that the Spanish embraced the game. Missionaries found the sport carnal and vulgar. Like many other elements of indigenous culture, this was suppressed and slowly faded from Spanish domains as ball courts fell into ruin and disuse and the old priestly elite class was eliminated. But thankfully, it didn't die because the ball game has actually survived to the present day. Many indigenous communities have ball game traditions that continue even now. A recent study reported that 13 surviving ball games are still played today in Mesoamerica. One area in particular where ball games are still being played is in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. This peripheral area was never colonized on a large scale, so ball games likely continued uninterrupted. A look at the names of the different games, Ulama de Brazo, Ulama de Cadera, and Ulama de Palo, suggest a pre-Hispanic origin due to the similarity to the Nahuatl word Ulamalitzli. If you go to certain areas of Sinaloa, you can still find people playing the game as their ancestors did. Further south, in Michoacan, you can find several communities playing Pelota Purepecha. One version of the game that I cannot resist bringing to your attention is Pelota Purepecha Encendida. Like other Purepecha ball games, it's played with sticks and a ball, except in this version, the ball is soaked in petroleum and then set ablaze. That's metal. Where do I sign up? In the former Maya areas of Guatemala and Belize, the ball games of choice are Poctapoc, Cha, and Chache. My apologies for any mispronunciations. Over in Oaxaca, Pelota Mixteca survives in many Mixtec communities. This one is a bit different from most of the games that we've seen and involves using a padded glove to strike the ball rather than a stick or the hips. Heck, when I was in Oaxaca earlier this year, I found this awesome mural of a Pelota Mixteca game in San Jose Magote. For these Mixtec communities, the games and tournaments are community events bound by mutually agreed upon rules and customs that bring different communities together and build and maintain old relationships. For the Mixteca, it's also an important link with their distant past. A local veteran player reported in a recent interview that they believe Pelota Mixteca is thousands of years old and has been passed down from their ancestors to them. What's even better is that these games are growing in popularity. Since the mid-20th century, efforts have been made to revive these sports, and the last few decades have proved remarkably fruitful. Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and Belize all have ball game leagues where teams can compete against each other, and there are even international tournaments. There's a lot that you can read about the modern game, but a detailed treatment is best suited for another video. The takeaway is that the ball game never died out, and that the future of these ball games looks brighter now than it has in a long time. The Mesoamerican ballgame was more than just a game. In fact, if you want to be a little spicy, you could say that it was neither Mesoamerican nor a game, because it had appeal far beyond Mesoamerica and it came in many varieties. The ball games were a cultural phenomenon that ran deep in many Mesoamerican cultures for thousands of years, so much so that ball games were even incorporated into their mythologies, most clearly seen in the Popol Vuh. The ball game had incredible appeal. Men and women of different social classes participated and played either as recreation or as part of community events. As Mesoamerican culture became more sophisticated, the game took on additional meaning and prestige. Rulers began to depict themselves as elite ball players, recreating mythological scenes or using the game as a metaphor for war, sacrifice, or fertility. All of this may strike us as foreign, and indeed, to the Spanish who had never seen any sport like it, it was just that. However, I think we can see a lot of similarities between the ancient people of Mesoamerica and ourselves. We imbue our own sports with special meaning and relish the rivalries that they create. We gamble and bet on the outcomes of games. We elevate our own professional and collegiate athletes into heroes and even bestow hefty personal and financial rewards to them. It's incredible to me that the Mesoamerican ballgame can feel so ancient and strange, and yet so modern and familiar. Speaking of the ancient and modern, it's time for that special announcement that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. I'm very pleased to announce our 2026 channel trip to Mexico City. For 7 days next August, we will spend time in and around Mexico City, visiting places like Teotihuacan, historic Mexico City, Lake Xochimilco, the Basilica of Guadalupe, and the National Museum of Anthropology. We'll have lots of great activities like riding a trajinera, learning about ancient chocolate, visiting a pulqueria, taking a mezcal mixology class, and more. If you couldn't catch our Peru or Oaxaca trip from the past 2 years, this is a great chance to travel with other curious individuals from all over the place. If you want to experience the rich culture of Mexico City up close and make some new friends, you can click on the link below to review the trip details and book your spot. Remember, space is limited, so don't wait until the last minute. I'm really excited about this, and I hope that many of you are too. Let's go to Mexico. And that's going to wrap us up for today. Special thanks to my patrons listed here. You guys are the best. If you'd like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and follow us on Facebook. Take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.